On a freezing Monday morning in November, a completely gutted, soot-blackened aircraft fuselage sat on the polished concrete floor of a private hangar at Beacon Point Airfield. The frame was twisted from an intense localized fire, the cockpit instrumentation was melted into an unreadable slab of slag, and the aluminum skin was warped beyond recognition. The official auction catalog listed it as Lot 82, a scrap-grade 1,974 twin-engine utility frame recovered from a warehouse collapse in Indiana. The opening bid was set at $300. More than 80 elite aviation collectors, aerospace executives, and salvage brokers stood in the room. They wore bespoke cashmere overcoats and tailored wool suits, sipping espresso from porcelain cups while glancing through digital catalogs on their tablets. Not one of them looked twice at Lot 82. To them, it was nothing but 2 tons of liability, an expensive headache that would cost more to haul to a landfill than any scrap metal dealer would ever pay for it. Victoria Sterling moved through the crowd with the absolute, unhurried authority that came from running Sterling Aerospace Solutions, a multi-billion-dollar defense and corporate aviation empire. Dressed in a flawless navy blue tailoring with her blonde hair pinned back securely, she didn't look at the salvage. She was there for Lot 85, a pristine vintage business jet. When her chief appraiser, Marcus Thorne, walked past the charred hull of Lot 82, he didn't even pause his tablet screen. He had already written his evaluation weeks ago based on insurance photographs. 0 structural integrity, total thermal degradation, non-recoverable junk. Standing on the periphery of the wealthy crowd was Garrett Mercer. He was 29 years old, wearing a faded canvas work jacket over a dark flannel shirt, his boots scuffed and his hands stained with the faint, permanent shadow of aviation fuel and turbine grease. He had been awake since 3 in the morning, working a double shift at his small, single-bay repair hangar on the industrial edge of the county. He had driven 90 minutes in an aging pickup truck just to stand in this room. Clutching his right hand was his 7-year-old daughter, Lily. She wore a bright red winter coat that was slightly too small for her, her small boots tapping softly against the concrete. Under her left arm, she tightly held a vintage brass navigation compass, a relic Garrett had given her from his old flight bag. She didn't look at the wealthy buyers. She looked up at her father, trusting his quiet, steady presence implicitly. Garrett stepped toward the charred airframe. He didn't look at the melted cockpit or the scorched tail section. His eyes locked onto a highly specific structural feature at the wing root interface. The structural box section wasn't stamped or riveted in the standard commercial style of the 70s. It was joined by an incredibly precise, continuous electron beam weld, a hyper-advanced technique used almost exclusively by a legendary, short-lived military aerospace contractor in the early 1960s. Garrett knew that weld. He had spent 4 years in the United States Air Force as an elite master technician working on classified airframes before a family tragedy forced him back into civilian life to raise Lily alone. His own grandfather had been one of the 5 master machinists at Vanguard Aero, a boutique firm that collapsed in 1965 after producing only 3 custom executive transports for the world's most powerful families. Garrett knelt down on the cold floor, completely ignoring the judgmental stares of the billionaires around him. He reached out with a gloved hand, gently pressing against the underside of the main bulkhead frame. The geometry was subtly altered by the fire, but the core dimensions were unmistakable to someone who could read structural engineering by feel. Julian Vance, a prominent billionaire collector known for his massive private air fleet and his legendary arrogance, stepped near the lot, laughing loudly as he spoke to his assistant. He looked down at Garrett with open amusement, noticing the grease on his jacket and the young girl standing beside him. Julian adjusted his gold watch and spoke loudly enough for Victoria Sterling and half the room to hear. He wondered aloud why the airfield security was letting local mechanics use the auction floor as a daycare center, adding that some people simply couldn't accept that junk belonged in a dumpster. A few surrounding brokers chuckled and Marcus Thorne offered a dismissive smirk. Victoria Sterling paused, her cold emerald eyes sweeping over Garrett and Lily. 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 Her expression remained entirely guarded and neutral, the face of a woman who viewed the world strictly in terms of profit and loss. She saw a man who looked like he couldn't afford the entry fee, let alone the salvage. Garrett didn't flinch. His face remained completely calm, his jaw set with a quiet, masculine strength that didn't need to shout to be felt. He stood up, squeezed Lily's hand gently to let her know everything was fine, and looked directly at the auctioneer. The auctioneer cleared his throat, eager to get past the scrap lot. He called for an opening bid of $300, expecting total silence. Before he could even finish the sentence, Garrett raised his hand. The room fell completely silent for a beat. Julian Vance smirked, shaking his head in disbelief at the sheer foolishness of the purchase. Victoria Sterling watched silently as Garrett walked up to the side registration desk, pulled 3 crisp $100 bills from his worn leather wallet, and signed the release paperwork. As Garrett guided Lily toward the exit to bring his truck around, Julian Vance called out one last mocking comment, asking if he needed to borrow a wheelbarrow to haul his new prize away. Garrett stopped, turned his head slightly, and fixed Julian with a gaze so steady, so cold, and so completely devoid of fear that the billionaire's smile instantly vanished. Garrett didn't say a word. He simply walked out into the freezing wind. 2 hours later, the charred airframe was secured to a heavy-duty flatbed trailer hitched behind Garrett's truck. As they began the slow drive back to his workshop, Lily looked out the back window at the blackened, ugly shape trailing behind them. She turned to her father and asked if the airplane was broken forever. Garrett gripped the steering wheel, his eyes focused on the highway ahead, and told her that sometimes the most valuable things in the world just needed the right light to be seen. But as he pulled into the gravel yard of his isolated hangar, he noticed a sleek, unmarked black SUV parked directly blocking his garage doors, its engine idling silently in the dark. Garrett shifted the truck into park, the old transmission clunking heavily in the quiet yard. The high beams caught the glossy finish of the luxury SUV blocking his way. For a moment, the only sound was the low rumble of his truck engine and the whistle of the November wind whipping across the gravel. "Stay inside where it's warm for a second, Lily," Garrett said softly, his voice a steady, grounding anchor in the dim cabin. Lily looked at the large black vehicle, then back at her father, nodding as she hugged her brass compass tightly against her chest. Garrett pulled the handbrake, opened the door, and stepped down onto the loose stones. His heavy work boots crunched in the silence as he walked toward the front of his truck. The rear door of the SUV swung open. Victoria Sterling stepped out into the biting cold. Even in the bleak industrial setting of Blackwood Ridge, she looked entirely in command, her long wool coat buttoned to the throat, her posture rigid. She didn't look like someone who belonged in a gravel yard surrounded by rusted tool chests and old brake rotors, yet she showed no hesitation. "Mr. Mercer," Victoria said, her voice carrying the sharp, polished edge of a corporate boardroom. Garrett stopped a few feet away, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his canvas jacket. He didn't look intimidated by her presence or the 2 large security drivers who remained inside the idling SUV. He simply waited, his face unreadable, his eyes reflecting the pale glare of the headlights. "I don't usually follow auction buyers to their homes," Victoria continued, stepping closer, her eyes drifting for a fraction of a second to the tarp-covered airframe on the trailer behind his truck. "But my appraiser made an error today. He missed a specific notation in the original liquidation filing from the Indiana warehouse. I like to correct errors immediately." Garrett remained silent, letting the wind fill the gap between them. His quiet masculinity seemed to frustrate her subtle attempts at dominance. "I'm prepared to offer you $5,000 for the salvage," she said, her tone businesslike, as if the transaction were already concluded. "You bought it for $300. That is a significant return on your investment for a 2-hour drive. My team will unhook the trailer and haul it away right now. You don't even have to unload it." Garrett looked from Victoria to the heavy black SUV, then back to her eyes. "The offer is generous, Miss Sterling," he said, his voice low and calm. "But the trailer isn't for sale, and neither is the lot." Victoria's emerald eyes narrowed slightly. Her professional shield tightened. "Mr. Mercer, let's be practical. You run a single-bay maintenance shop. You look after crop dusters and local charter twins. This frame is a burned-out shell. It has no documentation, no logbooks, and no certified parts left to harvest. It is a financial sinkhole for someone in your position. $5,000 can upgrade your diagnostics tools or cover your overhead for the winter. Why risk that for scrap?" Before Garrett could answer, the passenger door of his pickup truck creaked open. Lily stepped down onto the running board, her small red coat bright against the gray twilight. She had dropped her winter mitten in the footwell, and her bare hand was trembling slightly from the sudden rush of freezing air. "Daddy?" Lily called out, her voice small but clear. "My coat button got stuck." The contrast between them was instant. Victoria stood frozen, her rigid business persona offering no warmth or utility in the face of a cold, shivering child. She looked momentarily helpless, completely out of her element. Garrett turned immediately, his entire demeanor shifting from guarded strength to absolute tenderness. He didn't care about the multi-billion-dollar CEO standing in his driveway. He walked over to his daughter, knelt in the gravel, and took her cold hand between his large, calloused palms, gently rubbing them to restore the heat. "I've got you, baby," Garrett whispered, his voice incredibly soft as he carefully untangled the plastic button from the fabric of her scarf. "There you go. Go sit back inside the cab, okay? I'll be right there." Lily smiled, completely reassured by his presence, and scrambled back into the warmth of the truck, closing the door behind her. Garrett stood back up, the calm solidity returning to his face as he turned back to Victoria. The wealthy executive had been watching the interaction in total silence. For a brief second, a flicker of something raw and vulnerable crossed Victoria's face, a sudden realization that all the money and corporate power she wielded couldn't replicate the absolute security this man provided to his daughter with a single look. She adjusted her coat, trying to reclaim her composure. "My offer stands, Mr. Mercer," she said, though her voice lacked its previous razor-sharp certainty. $10,000. Cash transfer tonight." Garrett walked to the side of his trailer, reaching down to pull back a loose corner of the heavy blue tarp. The moving air exposed a jagged, soot-stained section of the forward wing root weld. Under the pale industrial lights of the yard, the unique, continuous electron weld gleamed faintly beneath the grime. "You didn't come here because of an error in a liquidation filing, miss." "Sterling," Garrett said, looking directly at her. "You came because you realized your chief appraiser doesn't know the difference between standard assembly line riveting and custom military-grade fusion. You know exactly who built this structural box." Victoria's breath hitched slightly in the cold air. Garrett stepped closer, his physical presence grounded and undeniable. Vanguard Aero only produced 3 executive transports before they closed their doors in '65. This isn't a '74 utility frame. This is the lost prototype. And you don't offer $10,000 for scrap metal unless you're trying to buy a confession. Victoria stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized this local mechanic had just dismantled her entire negotiation strategy without raising his voice. Before she could speak, her phone buzzed violently inside her coat pocket. She pulled it out, seeing the name of her lead archival researcher flashing on the screen. She answered it, keeping her eyes locked on Garrett. "Victoria," the researcher's voice came through, sounding frantic and out of breath. "We just pulled the metallurgical registry from the National Archives. If that chassis number matches the weld profile, that airplane didn't carry executives. It carried the private blueprints for the entire modern military turbine program. It's been missing for 50 years. Victoria slowly lowered the phone, her face pale, staring at the quiet man in the flannel shirt as the true scale of the mystery began to unravel. The smell of maple syrup and stale coffee filled the crowded booths of the Silver Wing Diner, a small roadside eatery located just outside the perimeter fence of the airfield. It was 7 o'clock Tuesday morning, and the diner was packed with local charter pilots, mechanics in oil-stained overalls, and regional cargo haulers seeking refuge from the freezing rain outside. Garrett sat in a corner booth, the collar of his denim shirt unbuttoned, calmly reading a printed schematic sheet laid flat on the Formica table. Lily sat opposite him, her small legs swinging beneath the seat. She was completely absorbed in polishing her brass navigation compass with a paper napkin, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. A plate of chocolate chip pancakes sat between them, half-eaten. "You missed a spot on the bezel, Lily," Garrett said softly, pointing a thick, calloused finger at the edge of the brass casing. Lily squinted at the compass, gave it a firm rub with her napkin, and beamed up at him. "Grandpa said if you keep the glass clean, the needle never gets lost. Right, Daddy?" "Right, baby," Garrett replied, his voice laced with a gentle warmth that entirely transformed his rugged features. He reached over and lightly tapped the tip of her nose, making her giggle. The bell above the diner door jingled loudly, cutting through the low murmur of conversation. The sudden silence that followed was heavy. Julian Vance walked in, accompanied by 2 men in dark business suits, and a third man wearing a high-visibility tactical jacket with the words Regional Aviation Authority stamped across the back. Julian scanned the room with a look of intense distaste, his leather dress shoes clicking sharply on the linoleum floor until his eyes locked onto Garrett's booth. The diner patrons watched in silence as Julian marched across the room, stopping right at the edge of Garrett's table. He slammed a heavy, blue-stamped folder onto the formica, narrowly missing Lily's plate of pancakes. "We have a problem, Mercer," Julian announced, his voice loud enough to echo off the wood-paneled walls. Garrett didn't look up immediately. He carefully folded his schematic sheet, slid it into his jacket pocket, and then looked at Julian with a terrifyingly calm expression. He didn't rise from his seat. He didn't show anger. His quiet masculinity seemed to anchoring the entire corner of the diner. "You're making a scene in front of my daughter, Vance," Garrett said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a low, dangerous resonance. "Step back from the table." Julian scoffed, leaning in closer, gesturing to the man in the tactical jacket. "This is Carlton Briggs, Chief Compliance Officer for the North District Airfields. We've just filed an emergency administrative hold on your shop. That charred piece of garbage sitting on your trailer is an uncertified hazardous military origin structure. You don't have the licenses to store it, you don't have the clearance to transport it, and you certainly don't have the right to keep it." The surrounding pilots began whispering among themselves. Carlton Briggs stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously under Garrett's unyielding stare. "Mr. Mercer, under Regional Safety Code 404, we are authorized to impound any undocumented wreckage presenting a chemical or structural hazard to local airspace operations. The flatbed trailer in your yard is being hooked up to an authority transport vehicle as we speak." Lily shrank back into the vinyl booth, her hands trembling as she clutched her brass compass tightly against her chest. She looked up at Garrett, her eyes wide with fear. "Daddy, are they going to take the SAT airplane? Are we in trouble?" Garrett looked at his daughter, and the coldness in his eyes instantly melted into pure reassurance. He placed his large hand over hers, squeezing gently. "No, baby. Nobody is taking anything, and we aren't in trouble. Hold on to your compass for me." Garrett slowly stood up. He rose to his full height, his broad shoulders instantly blocking the light from the diner window, completely towering over Julian Vance. The billionaire took an involuntary half-step backward, his arrogant posture stiffening. "Mr. Briggs," Garrett said, turning his gaze to the inspector. His voice was steady, projecting an absolute, unquestionable expertise. "The airframe on my property is a Vanguard Aerostructural Test Unit manufactured in June of 1962. Under Federal Aviation Historical Preservation Law, Section 9, any non-commercial prototype over 50 years old without active fuel systems is classified as static historical property, not hazardous salvage. It falls completely outside your jurisdictional authority." Carlton Briggs blinked, his mouth opening slightly. He looked down at his paperwork, then back at Garrett. How? How do you know the manufacture date?" The identification plates were completely melted. Garrett leaned forward, his face inches from Julian's. "Because the secondary serial number isn't on a plate, Vance. It's etched directly into the titanium firewall behind the tertiary intake manifold, using a triple redundant stamping matrix that only 5 people in the country know how to read. My grandfather was the man who stamped it. The ownership title was signed, paid for, and cleared by the auction clerk yesterday morning. If your tow trucks touch my trailer, I'll have a federal injunction on your desk before they hit the highway." Julian's face turned an ugly shade of crimson. The public humiliation in front of the local airfield community was entirely unendurable for him. He pointed a shaking finger at Garrett. "You think you're smart because you know some military junk history, mechanic? You're a nobody running a failing shop from a gravel driveway. I have enough capital to tie you up in litigation for the next 30 years. You will be bankrupt before the month ends." The diner door jingled again. Victoria Sterling walked in, her tailored black coat damp from the rain. She didn't look at Julian or the inspectors. She walked straight to the booth, her emerald eyes fixed entirely on Garrett. Julian turned to her, a triumphant smirk returning to his face. "Victoria. Perfect timing. Tell this grease monkey what happens when he tries to play games with the major contractors." Victoria stopped, looking down at Lily, who was still watching the adults with wide, anxious eyes. Victoria's cold, guarded expression faltered for a fraction of a second as she saw the little girl's hands gripping the old compass. She took a slow, deep breath, turning her gaze back to Julian. "Be quiet, Julian," Victoria said, her voice freezing the air in the room. Julian's smirk froze. "What?" "I just received the confirmed metallurgy report from my corporate headquarters," Victoria said, her voice deadpan, completely ignoring the billionaire's confusion. "The airframe isn't just a prototype, and it isn't an environmental hazard. The structural core contains the intact, unvandalized flight logs of the 1,963 diplomatic mission that vanished over the Appalachian Ridge. She turned directly to Garrett, her posture rigid, but her eyes filled with a sudden, overwhelming realization of what this man actually held. And those logs contained the original, unredacted corporate asset signatures for Sterling Aerospace, Vance Industries, and the Federal Defense Board. Mr. Mercer doesn't just own a piece of history, Julian. He owns the legal rights to the foundation of our entire industry. Julian Vance pushed past the diner's glass doors, his face contorted in a mixture of rage and desperation, leaving the compliance officers scrambling in his wake. Victoria Sterling did not follow them. She remained standing by Garrett's booth, the ambient light of the diner catching the sharp, tense lines of her jaw. "I need to see that airframe immediately, Mr. Mercer," Victoria said, her corporate mask slipping just enough to reveal a raw, driving urgency. "If those logs are intact, the entire legal architecture of the modern aerospace defense sector is about to shift. I am coming to your shop." Garrett slowly slid out of the booth, his movements unhurried. He looked down at Lily, who was carefully sliding her brass compass into her coat pocket. "You can follow us, Miss Sterling," Garrett said calmly, "but you stay outside the yellow line. My shop is a live workspace." By the time Garrett's pickup truck pulled into the gravel yard of his industrial hangar at Blackwood Ridge, the November rain had escalated into a violent, howling storm. The wind ripped across the open tarmac, tearing dead leaves from the tree line. But the weather wasn't the only problem. Two heavy-duty flatbed recovery commercial rigs belonging to Vance Industries were already backed up to Garrett's garage doors. Julian Vance stood in the downpour, shouting orders at four large crewmen who were aggressively wrapping thick steel winch cables around the tarp-covered trailer. They were attempting to hoist the entire structure onto their rig before a formal legal block could be processed. "Stop what you are doing right now," Victoria shouted, stepping out of her luxury SUV, her voice instantly adopting its commanding, intimidating edge. "You are tampering with a verified historical asset, Julian." Julian didn't look back. He waved his hand dismissively at his crew. "Drag it up, now." "I don't care about the historical status. We'll settle the fines in court. Lift it." The heavy winch motor groaned, the thick steel cable pulling taut with terrifying tension. The old flatbed trailer creaked under the immense, uneven strain as it was dragged sideways across the slick gravel. Garrett stepped out of his truck, his face turning to stone. He saw the danger instantly. The crew was using an unrated winch line at an unstable, acute angle. The mechanical tension was reaching a breaking point. "Lily, stay in the cab," Garrett ordered, his voice echoing with a striking, absolute authority that made even the nearest winch operator freeze. But Lily, terrified by the grinding screech of the metal and the shouting adults, scrambled out of the passenger door to run toward her father. She took 3 running steps into the dark yard just as the worst happened. With a deafening, gunshot-like crack, the high-tension steel winch cable snapped. The severed line whipped violently through the freezing air, its frayed metal end slashing across the yard with enough force to cut through concrete. It struck a massive, multi-tier steel industrial storage rack sitting just outside the hangar door. The heavy rack, loaded with thousands of pounds of discarded cast-iron turbine casings and heavy engine blocks, groaned under the kinetic impact and began to tilt outward. "Lily!" Garrett roared. The massive steel rack collapsed forward into the dark mud. Lily tripped, falling into a narrow, hollow recess between the hangar wall and a concrete generator housing just as the avalanche of heavy iron and steel debris crashed down over the gap, completely burying the exit and trapping her in pitch darkness beneath the heavy weight. The yard went completely silent, save for the howling wind and the sudden, sharp sound of a child screaming in pure terror from beneath the collapsed steel structure. "Lily!" Victoria screamed. The multi-billion-dollar CEO, a woman feared by thousands of employees, and known for her ruthless, ice-cold control under immense corporate pressure, completely shattered. Seeing a little girl buried under tons of twisted iron stripped away every ounce of her professional armor, Victoria lost total control. Her hands began trembling violently, her face turned pale as ash, and she began panicking internally, spinning around in circles while shouting frantically at her security drivers. "Get the jacks! Lift it!" Someone lift it! "Oh my God, she's under there!" Victoria cried out, her voice cracking hysterically as she ran toward the debris, completely helpless. She tried to pull at a heavy iron casing, but her expensive leather gloves slipped and the structural weight didn't even budge. She froze, completely paralyzed by the raw horror of the situation, unable to form a coherent thought as Lily's frantic, muffled crying echoed from the darkness. Garrett was the exact emotional opposite. While everyone else froze in sheer panic, his entire being became perfectly steady, grounded in a quiet, masculine strength. He didn't shout, he didn't panic. He moved with the calculated, rapid precision of an elite military operator. He dropped to his knees in the mud beside the collapsed rack, assessing the structural load centers in 3 seconds. He found a massive 500-pound steel support beam pinning down the main section of the debris directly over the gap where Lily was trapped. The structure was settling deeper into the mud with every passing second, threatening to crush the hollow pocket completely. "Lily, look at the light. Listen to my voice, baby," Garrett said. His voice was incredibly warm, low, and entirely devoid of fear, a solid anchor cutting through the chaotic storm, and Victoria's panicked shouting. The moment Lily heard her father's calm voice, her hysterical screaming instantly stopped. She sobbed, her voice trembling from the dark gap. "Daddy, I dropped my compass. It's dark. I'm scared." "I'm right here, Lily. You are perfectly safe," Garrett said softly, his face perfectly composed as he braced his broad shoulders directly beneath the heavy steel support beam. He dug his heavy boots into the wet gravel, his jaw tightening as he prepared to lift a weight that a normal human shouldn't be able to move. "I want you to crawl forward toward my hands right now. Don't look back. Just look at me." Victoria watched in stunned, breathless silence, her hands pressed against her mouth as she witnessed a man displaying a level of emotional security and physical courage that no amount of money could ever buy. Garrett let out a low, focused breath, his muscles straining against the canvas of his jacket as he single-handedly lifted the massive steel beam just enough to clear a 6-inch opening. The metal groaned against his strength. Lily wiggled forward through the narrow gap, her small hand reaching out until Garrett caught her wrist, gently pulling her completely free from the collapsing debris and tucking her securely against his chest. The heavy steel rack collapsed completely into the mud behind her with a sickening thud. Garrett held Lily tightly, his large hand cradling the back of her head as she sobbed into his shoulder. "You're okay, baby. I've got you." "You're safe," he whispered, completely ignoring the rain pouring over them. Victoria sank to her knees in the gravel a few feet away, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her eyes wide as she looked at Garrett's calm, protective embrace. She had never felt more vulnerable or more deeply awed by another human being in her life. Julian Vance stood by his transport truck, his face pale as he realized how close his reckless actions had come to a fatal catastrophe. Garrett slowly stood up, holding his daughter tightly with one arm. He turned his gaze to the side where the snapped cable had struck the airframe during the chaos. The violent impact had sheared away a false sheet metal panel near the main bulkhead. As the torrential rain washed away decades of soot from the newly exposed compartment, Garrett's eyes locked onto what lay hidden inside. It wasn't a bundle of paper flight logs. It was a sleek, perfectly preserved, military-grade titanium case bearing a glowing, active electronic seal that shouldn't have had power for 50 years and a crimson classification stamp that made Victoria Sterling gasp aloud. The rain pounded against the concrete yard, but no one moved. The crimson stamp on the exposed titanium case glowed under the harsh industrial lights, cutting through the darkness. It read, Project Eclipse, Horizon, United States Air Force Strategic Intelligence Command. Beneath the text, the active electronic seal pulsed with a faint, steady amber light, casting rhythmic shadows across the wet gravel. Victoria Sterling stepped backward, her breath catching in her throat. Her mind raced through 30 years of aerospace history. Project Eclipse Horizon was the legendary black-budget program that had completely vanished from the Pentagon's official ledgers in the winter of 1963. It was a program her own father had tried to track down for decades, a phantom operation rumored to have developed the foundational engine patents that built every modern supersonic stealth aircraft in the sky today. Julian Vance stared at the glowing container, his previous anger instantly morphing into a cold, calculating greed. He stepped toward his remaining crewmen, his voice trembling but determined. "Mercer, you don't know what you've stumbled into," Julian said, his eyes locked onto the titanium case. "That is classified government property. You cannot legally hold it. My company has an elite federal defense clearance. We are taking possession of that asset right now for national security." Garrett didn't answer him. He didn't even look at the billionaire. He kept his arm securely wrapped around Lily, walking past the shattered steel rack and toward the main entrance of his hangar. "Mr. Vance," Garrett said, his voice dropping into a terrifyingly quiet, measured register that echoed over the howling wind. "If you or your men step within 5 feet of that airframe again, I will classify it as an active breach of a secure military asset. You won't be dealing with the local police. You will be dealing with the United States Department of Defense." Julian scoffed, pulling his satellite phone from his coat pocket. "You're a civilian mechanic, Mercer. I am a phone call away from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I can have a federal tactical unit here in 20 minutes to seize this entire property." Garrett stopped at the heavy steel hangar door. He turned around slowly, the rain dripping from the brim of his canvas cap, his face entirely expressionless. "Then, call them Vance," Garrett said calmly. "Tell them that the active transponder inside chassis 0182 has just initiated a triple encrypted handshake protocol. Tell them that the encryption sequence was acknowledged by the primary receiving station at Offutt Air Force Base exactly 40 seconds ago. They already know we are standing here. And they already know who is holding the key." Julian froze, his thumb hovering over the keypad of his phone. His face drained of color as he realized Garrett wasn't guessing. He looked at the pulsing amber light on the case, which had suddenly shifted to a rapid, flashing green sequence. Garrett slid open the heavy hangar door, carried Lily inside the dry, cavernous space, and closed the steel barrier behind them, shutting out the storm. Victoria Sterling didn't hesitate. She slipped through the closing gap right before the door locked into place, leaving Julian Vance standing outside in the freezing downpour. The interior of the hangar was immaculately organized. Despite the cracked concrete floors and the modest single-bay setup, every tool was perfectly clean and arranged by weight and metric dimension. There were no oil spills, no loose bolts, no clutter. It was the workspace of a man who treated mechanics like an exact science. Garrett walked into a small, glass-walled office at the back of the hangar. He gently set Lily down on a clean leather office chair and immediately pulled off her wet red coat. He grabbed a thick, dry green flannel shirt from a locker and wrapped it entirely around her shoulders like a blanket. "Are you hurt anywhere, Lily?" Garrett asked, kneeling in front of her, his large hands carefully checking her arms and legs for any scratches or bruises. His voice was completely soft, entirely focused on her well-being, shutting out the multi-billion-dollar crisis happening right outside the glass. Lily shook her head, her lower lip trembling slightly as she pulled the oversized flannel shirt tighter around herself. "I'm okay, Daddy, but I lost my compass in the mud. It went under the heavy metal." Garrett smiled, a warm, reassuring expression that instantly wiped away the fear from her face. He reached out, gently wiping a streak of dark mud from her cheek. "I know exactly where it is, baby. As soon as the rain stops, I'll go get it for you. I promise. You just sit right here and drink some water." Lily nodded, trusting his promise completely, her breathing instantly returning to a calm, steady rhythm. Victoria stood just inside the office door, watching the scene in absolute silence. She was a woman who had spent her entire adult life surrounded by powerful men, generals, executives, politicians, billionaires, men who shouted, men who commanded large armies with a signature. Yet, she had never seen anyone carry themselves with the kind of immense, quiet authority that Garrett Mercer possessed. He hadn't raised his voice once, yet he had completely neutralized a billionaire, managed a catastrophic structural collapse, and comforted a terrified child without breaking a sweat. She looked away from Garrett for a moment, her eyes drifting across the small office desk. Sitting on a clean wooden shelf next to a photograph of a smiling woman was an old, polished mahogany shadow box. Inside, resting on a bed of faded blue velvet, was a United States Air Force Commendation Medal for Distinguished Service, alongside a rare, highly classified Master Technician emblem bearing the insignia of the 9th Strategic Logistics Group, the elite, ghost squadron that handled the maintenance of the military's most sensitive, experimental aircraft. Victoria's heart skipped a beat. She looked back at Garrett as he stood up from his daughter's side. "You weren't just a regular mechanic in the Air Force, Mr. Mercer," Victoria whispered, her voice stripped of its usual corporate coldness. "The 9th Strategic Logistics Group doesn't exist on any public roster. They are the only technicians cleared to handle the nuclear-capable stealth prototypes during the Cold War transitions. Your grandfather didn't just stand. You were trained by the very people who designed the Eclipse Horizon project." Garrett walked past her, his boots clicking softly on the floor as he approached the glass window looking out into the main hangar bay. He kept his eyes on the heavy outer doors, where the headlights of Julian Vance's trucks were still visible through the frosted glass panels. "My grandfather built things to last, Miss Sterling," Garrett said, his voice low and steady. "And he taught me that when a country buries its secrets in a warehouse, it's usually because someone at the top didn't want the truth to get out. Suddenly, a loud, deep hydraulic hum echoed from the front of the hangar. The emergency warning lights above the main entrance began to flash a violent crimson. A heavy automated security broadcast override cut through the hangar's speaker system, its mechanical voice, flat and unyielding, warning. Active military transponder tracking initiated. Airspace Restriction Zone 44 is now active. All unauthorized personnel must evacuate the perimeter immediately. Victoria turned toward the window, her hands trembling as she saw 3 large, unmarked military transport helicopters descending through the torrential rain, their massive searchlights cutting through the storm as they prepared to land directly in Garrett's gravel yard. The thunderous roar of the 3 massive military transport helicopters completely drowned out the sound of the wind and rain. The sheer force of their downdraft rattled the corrugated steel walls of the hangar, causing the hanging light fixtures to sway violently. Through the frosted glass windows of the office, the gravel yard was suddenly illuminated by blinding million candle power searchlights that turned the dark storm into a surreal, flashing daylight. Garrett stepped out of the office, his expression completely unbothered by the sudden arrival of a military task force. He walked toward the main hangar controls, his heavy boots moving in a steady, rhythmic cadence. Lily remained safely inside the glass room, wrapped in the oversized green flannel shirt, her eyes wide as she watched her father through the partition. Victoria Sterling followed Garrett closely, her heart pounding against her ribs. The cold, unyielding composure she usually maintained in the presence of international defense boards had completely evaporated. She looked at the man in the flannel shirt, realizing that every assumption she, Julian Vance, and the entire aviation community had made about him was fundamentally wrong. Garrett hit the manual override switch. The massive steel hangar doors groaned as they slid open, exposing the storm-swept yard to the interior of the building. Outside, the 3 unmarked black helicopters had touched down perfectly in a tight tactical formation, their massive rotor blades slicing through the sheets of rain. Dozens of heavily armed personnel dressed in sterile, identification-free tactical gear deployed instantly, forming a secure perimeter around the charred fuselage of Lot 82. Julian Vance was already sprinting toward the lead helicopter, shielding his eyes from the blinding spotlights. He spotted a tall, broad-shouldered military officer stepping down from the aircraft cabin, a man wearing a dark, waterproof trench coat with the silver eagles of a colonel pinned to his collar. "Colonel," Julian shouted, his voice cracking with desperation as he fought the wind. "Over here. I am Julian Vance, Chief Executive of Vance Industries. I initiated the emergency transponder alert. The asset is right there on that trailer. The local mechanic inside this hangar has illegally seized classified government property. I need your men to secure the vehicle and arrest him immediately." The officer, Colonel Thomas Albright, didn't stop walking. He didn't look at the burning glare of the searchlights, and he didn't look at the frantic billionaire waving his hands in the mud. Colonel Albright walked straight past Julian, his polished combat boots cutting through the gravel with absolute purpose. The tactical squad followed 2 paces behind him, completely ignoring Julian's commands. "Colonel, did you hear me?" Julian yelled, running along behind them, his expensive leather shoes completely ruined by the wet earth. "I have the highest civilian defense clearance in this sector. I demand you seize that airframe." Colonel Albright stepped inside the dry perimeter of the hangar, stopping exactly 10 feet from where Garrett Mercer stood. The tactical team instantly filed into the building, forming a defensive line that pushed Julian Vance, Carlton Briggs, and the remaining recovery crews completely outside into the rain. The hangar went dead silent, except for the distant, low hum of the idling helicopter turbines outside. Julian Vance pushed his way to the front of the line, pointing a finger at Garrett. "Arrest him! He's a nobody tampering with a national security project." Colonel Albright took off his dark uniform cap, completely ignoring the billionaire's outbursts. He looked at the clean, perfectly organized hangar tools, then shifted his gaze to the charred titanium firewall exposed on the flatbed trailer. Finally, his eyes locked onto Garrett. The veteran officer stood perfectly straight, placed his cap under his left arm, and delivered a crisp, absolute military salute directly to the man in the flannel shirt. "We received the automated handshake protocol 40 seconds ago," Chief Master Sergeant Mercer, Colonel Albright said, his voice carrying a deep, resonant authority that echoed off the high rafters of the building. "It has been 7 years since your retirement from Active Logistics Command. The Department of Defense acknowledges your activation of the Project Eclipse Horizon core interface." Julian Vance's jaw dropped. He stood frozen in the rain, His breath caught in his throat as the world he thought he controlled completely shattered around him. A chief master sergeant? A military logistics legend? He looked from the immaculate salute to Garrett's calm, unblinking face. Victoria Sterling gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Chief Master Sergeant Garrett Mercer wasn't just a mechanic. He was the legendary black-budget operations specialist who had single-handedly managed the maintenance protocols for the entire experimental stealth fleet in the late 90s and early 2000s. He was the most decorated non-commissioned officer in the modern history of the Strategic Logistics Command. Colonel Albright lowered his salute, his face softening with a deep, personal respect. Your grandfather's original non-disclosure covenants expired at midnight last night, Garrett. The emergency hold placed on Lot 82 by the Indiana warehouse liquidation was a corporate cover-up orchestrated by Vance Industries 20 years ago to keep these patents buried. But your grandfather didn't just build the firewall. He left the legal succession rights explicitly to you. The colonel turned his head slightly, fixing Julian Vance with a gaze that was colder than the November rain. Mr. Vance, your civilian clearance is officially revoked as of 30 seconds ago. Your crews will leave this airfield immediately. If your vehicles are still on this property in 3 minutes, my men will classify it as espionage against an active military installation. Julian's face turned an ash-gray color. The public reversal was total. The very man he had humiliated on the auction floor, the man he had called a nobody in front of his peers, was the supreme legal custodian of the technology that built his entire corporate empire. Without those patents, Vance Industries would face billions of dollars in federal clawbacks. Julian stumbled backward into the mud, his power completely stripped away, unable to utter a single word, as his own tow trucks began reversing out of the yard in a panic. Colonel Albright looked back at Garrett, gesturing to the glowing green seal on the titanium case. The asset is secure, Chief. The Global Defense Grid has verified your biometric handshake. The title of this airframe, and every breakthrough contained within its structure, belongs entirely to the Mercer estate. What are your orders? Colonel Albright stood at perfect attention, waiting for the command of a man who wore no uniform, held no corporate title, and possessed nothing but a single-bay hangar and a reputation forged in the absolute darkest corners of military aviation history. Secure the airframe inside the main bay for tonight, Colonel, Garrett said, his voice entirely level, completely untouched by the grand display of military power surrounding his property. Keep a standard perimeter detail until the storm clears. I want the transport logistics finalized by tomorrow morning at 0600. Consider it done, Chief, Albright replied, stepping back to coordinate his team. With quiet, clockwork efficiency, the tactical personnel moved into action. Within 90 seconds, Julian Vance's remaining security drivers had fled the gravel yard, their tires throwing wet stones into the air as they raced toward the highway. The 3 massive transport helicopters dimmed their blinding searchlights, leaving only the steady, rhythmic strobe of their running lights cutting through the freezing rain. Garrett did not immediately look at the glowing green titanium case, nor did he look at Victoria Sterling, who was standing frozen against the office partition. Instead, he stepped right back out into the torrential rain, walking directly toward the muddy hollow where the massive steel storage rack had collapsed. Victoria watched him through the glass window, her breath fogging the pain. She saw him drop to one knee in the freezing mud, completely disregarding his dry clothes or his own physical comfort. He dug his bare hands into the cold earth beneath a twisted iron girder, searching methodically until his fingers closed around a small, glinting object. It was Lily's brass navigation compass. Garrett stood up, wiped the thick mud from the brass casing using the dry inner lining of his canvas jacket, and walked back inside the hangar. He didn't check the multi-billion-dollar military prototype. He walked straight past the glowing Project Eclipse Horizon container, opened the glass door to his office, and knelt back down in front of his daughter. "Here you go, baby," Garrett said softly, his voice instantly radiating that deep, comforting warmth that seemed to push the entire cold world away, clean as a whistle. The needle is still pointing straight north. Lily's eyes instantly lit up with absolute joy. She grabbed the polished brass compass, hugging it tightly against her chest as she threw her small arms around Garrett's neck. "Thank you, Daddy. I knew you'd find it." "I always will, Lily," Garrett whispered, holding her securely, his large hand cradling her back until her breathing steadied completely into a peaceful rhythm. Victoria stood just outside the office doorway, her hands trembling slightly inside her coat pockets. The absolute contrast between her world and this man's reality was staggering. She had spent her entire life believing that safety was something bought with armored vehicles, premium security details, and massive corporate legal teams. She had viewed power as the ability to command a room or dictate terms to international boards. Yet, looking at Garrett, she realized she had never witnessed true security until now. This man provided absolute, unwavering safety to his child without trying, simply through the sheer solidity of his character. When the entire yard was collapsing and a military task force was descending, his primary focus remained entirely on a child's broken promise. Victoria felt a rare, deep vulnerability swelling in her chest. For the first time in her adult life, she realized she had everything money could buy, except the profound peace radiating from this humble mechanic's workspace. She stepped slowly into the office, her high-heeled boots silent on the floor. Her intimidating, cold demeanor was completely gone, replaced by a quiet, genuine reverence. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Mercer," Victoria said, her voice dropping its sharp corporate edge, sounding remarkably human, almost breathless. "Not just for today, but for the way my appraiser and I treated you at the auction floor. We saw a man in a flannel shirt and assumed we understood your limit. We thought your silence was lack of options." Garrett stood up slowly, turning to face her. His quiet masculinity filled the small office, his gaze steady and entirely devoid of resentment. "A lot of people look, Miss Sterling," he said, his voice low and calm. "Very few people actually take the time to see." Victoria met his eyes, a subtle, intense connection growing between them in the quiet room. She looked at his rugged, weathered features, noticing the faint lines of exhaustion, but also the absolute, unbreakable strength beneath them. "My father spent his entire life trying to find the missing structural links to Project Eclipse Horizon," she whispered, her hands tightening inside her pockets. "He died before he could ever prove it existed. If these patents are legally yours, Sterling Aerospace is prepared to offer you full, transparent, institutional partnership. No corporate games, no hostile terms. We will build whatever you want on your conditions." Garrett looked at her for a long, silent moment, the quiet stretching out between them until it was interrupted by a strange, harmonic chime echoing from the main hangar bay. The green flashing sequence on the titanium case had suddenly stopped. The central console interface on the container activated, casting a vivid, high-density blue projection against the corrugated steel wall of the hangar. A localized wireless data stream began radiating from the unit. Suddenly, inside Victoria's coat pocket, her private corporate tablet began vibrating violently. She pulled it out, her emerald eyes widening in absolute shock as the screen bypassed her biometric security locks completely. A highly restricted, decades-old private encryption protocol, a specific numerical sequence known only to her deceased father, flashed across her screen in bright red text, beginning a rapid, automated download from Garrett's airframe. Victoria stood entirely motionless, the brilliant blue light from the digital projection reflecting off her trembling tablet screen. The numbers cascading across her display finally stabilized, revealing a single, unredacted executive deed from December 1963. It bore two signatures written in elegant, ink-faded cursive: Arthur Sterling, founder of Sterling Aerospace, and Lawrence Mercer, chief master machinist of Vanguard Aero. Beneath their names lay a single, explicit legal covenant. The Project Eclipse Horizon patents were never meant to be owned by a government agency or a corporate board. They were a joint private safeguard hidden away by two visionary friends who realized that Julian Vance's father was preparing to falsify defense records to monopolize the global aviation grid. The true ownership had been legally bound to the Mercer family line for operational control, with a permanent protection clause assigned to the Sterling estate. Victoria slowly lowered her tablet, her emerald eyes shining with a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion. She looked at Garrett, her voice barely above a whisper, entirely stripped of her corporate armor. "My father didn't lose this airframe," she said, a solitary tear escaping and tracing a path down her pale cheek. "He helped your grandfather hide it. He spent the last 20 years of his life pretending to look for it just to ensure Vance's family would never suspect it was safe right here in Blackwood Ridge." Garrett looked at the glowing projection, his face maintaining that steady, quiet masculinity that had anchored his daughter through the worst of the storm. "My grandfather always told me that true craftsmanship isn't about building something everyone can see," Garrett said softly, his voice echoing with a profound weight. It's about building something that stands the test of time when everyone else closes their eyes. The justice that followed over the next 12 hours was absolute, swift, and completely public. By 6 o'clock Tuesday morning, as the gray dawn finally broke through the dissipating storm clouds, federal marshals and defense audit teams had completely locked down the corporate headquarters of Vance Industries. Julian Vance's reckless deployment of unrated recovery rigs and his fraudulent attempt to seize a sovereign military asset had triggered a massive federal investigation. Stripped of his civilian clearances and facing catastrophic corporate fraud charges, Julian was systematically removed from his executive board before the stock market even opened. The billionaire who had stood on the polished concrete of Beacon Point Airfield mocking a man in a flannel shirt was completely wiped out, his empire dismantled by the very blueprints he had tried to steal. Outside the hangar, the 3 military transport helicopters spun up their massive rotors for a peaceful departure. Colonel Albright delivered a final, respectful salute to Garrett before stepping onto the lead aircraft, leaving a specialized low-profile logistics detail to assist with the formal preservation transport. The gravel yard was quiet now, the puddles reflecting a clear, crisp autumn sky. Garrett stood at the center of his main bay, his canvas jacket open, his large hands resting inside his pockets. The charred fuselage of Lot 82 was gone, safely moved to a highly secure, climate-controlled preservation museum where the names of Lawrence Mercer and Arthur Sterling would permanently lead the historical exhibition. Yet, despite inheriting a legal estate worth billions of dollars in modern defense patents, Garrett hadn't changed a single thing about his life. The single-bay hangar remained perfectly clean, every tool arranged by exact metric weight. An old commercial twin-engine charter plane sat in the center of the bay, its cowling removed, waiting for a standard valve replacement. The heavy steel side door clicked open. Victoria Sterling walked into the hangar. She wasn't wearing her tailored navy blue corporate blazer or her expensive cashmere coat. She wore a simple dark wool sweater, her blonde hair tied back loosely, her expression warm, open, and entirely at peace. She carried a small paper bag from the Silver Wing Diner, the scent of fresh pastries drifting through the morning air. "I brought breakfast," Victoria said, her voice soft, carrying a rare, genuine melody that belonged exclusively to this quiet space. Garrett turned, a subtle, handsome smile touching the corners of his lips as he looked at her. "That's a dangerous investment for a CEO, miss." "Sterling," he said, his low voice laced with a gentle, teasing humor. Victoria stepped closer, stopping just a few feet from him, her gaze locking onto his steady eyes with a deep, natural connection that had grown through shared survival rather than corporate negotiation. "I told you, Garrett," she said softly, using his first name for the first time. "The terms are entirely on your conditions. Sterling Aerospace has officially finalized the historical foundation trust in your grandfather's name. The local technical college is receiving its first fully funded advanced mechanics scholarship tomorrow morning." Garrett nodded, a deep, silent appreciation passing between them. "Daddy, look!" Lily called out, sprinting down the wooden apartment stairs at the back of the hangar. She was wearing her red winter coat, completely recovered from the fear of the previous night. She slid across the polished concrete floor, stopping right in front of Victoria, and proudly held up her vintage brass navigation compass. "It's completely clean now. The needle points straight to the door." Victoria knelt down on the cold concrete, entirely unconcerned with her clothing, and looked at the little girl with a soft, affectionate smile. She gently touched the edge of the brass casing. "It's beautiful, Lily," Victoria whispered, her voice filled with a tenderness she hadn't felt in years. "Your dad told me that if you keep the glass clean, the needle never gets lost." Lily beamed, nodding aggressively as she tucked the compass securely back into her pocket. Then she reached out and grabbed Victoria's hand, pulling her toward the workbench where her drawing pads were laid out. "Come see the airplane I drew. It has big wings and it flies all the way to the mountains." Victoria looked up at Garrett, an unspoken question in her eyes. Garrett simply nodded, his rugged features radiating a profound, protective warmth as he watched his daughter welcome this powerful woman into their world. Victoria smiled, her hand securely holding Lily's small fingers as she let the little girl guide her away from the corporate world and into a future built on absolute safety, mutual respect, and a love that didn't need to shout to be felt. Garrett stood in the center of his quiet hangar, watching them walk toward the workbench together. The storm had completely passed, the morning light pouring through the high windows, illuminating the space exactly the way it was always meant to be seen.